Hi everyone, I'm Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and welcome to Jews Did It First.
You give me everything I have, you are the ground in which I stand, you are my life, my length of days, you are the rhythm in my veins, my heart pulses to your name, I rise from sleep and speak your praise before.
Since this is only my second episode, I want to remind everyone that if this is your first time listening, please check out the 10-minute introduction episode for all of my intros and disclaimers. It'll help put things into context for you. So, on with the show. Jews did it first. This one might be a little surprising, even to the religious Jews in the audience. I know I was pretty shocked when I discovered it and found it fascinating. We all know the story of Excalibur, right? There's a mythical sword, Excalibur, wedged into the anvil on a solid rock, and whoever is able to get the sword out will be the King of England. Perhaps you know the story from the 1963 Disney movie, The Sword and the Stone, or the 15th century version of Sir Thomas Malory. But the story was first popularized by the poem Merlin by, I'm going to butcher this, it's Robert de Boron. He's French. I assume it's Robert de Boron. Around the year 1200 or so. That's a pretty old story about an old king. The legend is that King Arthur lived somewhere around the year 500, I guess. Right around the same time Jews were codifying the Talmud, in case you were curious. An interesting story that caught my attention was also that of a Norse legend based on events of the same time period about a sword that could cut an anvil being lodged in a tree. Perhaps there's a connection, perhaps not. It's an interesting story. But of course, as always on this program, Jews did it first. There's a Jewish proto-story to that of King Arthur. And no, it's not even about King David. It's even earlier, all the way back to Moses himself. I'm going to tell you an account of the Midrash. What's the Midrash, you ask? Great question. Judaism is very clear about the fact that the entire Torah was given at Mount Sinai about 3,330 years ago. However, a cursory look at the Hebrew Bible, especially the Torah itself, 5 books of Moses, will reveal that there's a lot of missing information. For example, the very first section of Bereshis, Genesis, covers over 1,000 years in just a few chapters. So the Midrash is part of the body of literature that fills in the holes, as it were, in the biblical narrative. It's believed to have been given at Mount Sinai, along with the written Torah. However, it was only passed down orally. It was officially written down, however, to preserve the tradition in an ever-expanding, decentralizing world over the course of the first millennium. There are different types of Midrash. It contains a variety of stories, lessons, legal opinions that help flesh out the real story, the story behind the story, the gaps in the story of the Torah. In chapter 40 of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, it's a midrashic work, we learn a fascinating story. It goes like this. Rabbi Levi said, "The staff, which was created Bein Hashmashos, which is at dusk, referring to the time of dusk on the 6th day of creation, was handed down from Adam, the first man, to Hanoch, to Methuselah, Noach, Shem, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. When Joseph passed away, it was taken by Pharaoh's court." Remember, Joseph was second to command in Pharaoh's court over there. One of Pharaoh's advisors, who was Yisro, the priest of Midian, you might know him as Jethro. He became the father-in-law of Moses. He saw the letters engraved on the staff that had been taken from Joseph and realized that it was very special indeed. When he fled from Pharaoh, and this was because he didn't support the whole idea of oppressing the Jewish people and making them into slaves, So therefore he got kicked out. And when he fled, he took the staff with him and planted it in the ground in his yard. He said, whoever would be able to retrieve the staff from the ground would be able to marry his daughter. No one was able to remove the staff. Until Moses came along, brought home by Zipporah, his daughter. If you remember, there's a story where, recorded in the Bible, in Exodus, where the daughters of Israel, Zipporah among them, they couldn't get water from the well because some men were harassing them. Moses steps in, helps them out, and she brings him home to dad. Moshe was able to retrieve the staff from the ground, and Yisro said, he will go on to redeem Israel from Egypt. Sound familiar? In the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, about 1100 years before this poem of Merlin and the famed tale of King Arthur and his sword stuck into stone, the Midrash relates almost the exact same tale of a man pulling a staff from the ground, showing him to be the rightful heir of the leadership of a nation. Now, did de Boron have access to this information? It's hard to tell. It was somewhat in vogue for the intellectual elites to have a basic knowledge of Talmud and Jewish commentaries, in addition to the regular Greek and Roman classics. But Pirkei the Rebbe Eliezer is somewhat of an obscure text, even for a Jew, and certainly for a Gentile. But, whether directly or indirectly, or perhaps entirely independently, it's important to note that Jews did it first. And now, the counter-missionary. As always, it's usually best not to engage in these polemical discussions. This is for when you're backed into a corner, so to speak, and you need what to answer. Also, this will hopefully help Christians understand where Jews are coming from and why we don't accept their claims. Now, there's also a basic rule in Judaism. We don't typically say the name of the gods of other religions if they're still active religions, especially. Not some random religion that fell out, doesn't exist anymore, nobody's practicing it, but something like Christianity, which is still a very active religion, it's customary not to say the name of their gods. But not to say the name of the main character, so to speak, in this whole segment's a bit awkward. So therefore, I'm going to split the baby, as it were, and I'll be referring to him by the Spanish name of Jesus, and I figure that's different enough from our common usage, but also not too confusing, clearly recognizable to whom I'm referring. Now, we last left our story in Isaiah 53, the sacred cow of Christian proof texts for their messianic claims. Last week, we discussed the context of the passage and determined that, in general, it's the astonished kings of the world's description of the lowly, despised Jewish nation being elevated and glorified by God in the Messianic era. For details on this, and a full reading of Isaiah 53's 12 verses, you can go and listen to last week's episode, The Golden Rule. Today, we'll begin to analyze the particulars of the text to see if they validate Christian claims. Spoiler alert, not so much. So now that we understand the context of the passage, that is, the shock and amazement of the Gentile nations upon seeing the servant, Israel, the Jewish nation, redeemed by God and exonerated as truly righteous, the whole passage falls into place. I certainly don't need to go into depth on the idea of the despised view of the Jews in the world. You just look at the BDS movements on college campuses, anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere, the mainstream media's coverage of the Middle East. But there's more. I mentioned last week that Christians argue that since it uses the singular, it must be talking about an individual. And of course, they jump to, it must be Jesus. Now, first off, even if it was speaking of an individual, I don't see any reason to point to him in particular, but we'll talk about that more next week. But aside for the fact that multiple passages in the Bible speak of the nation of Israel in the singular, Isaiah 53 itself alternates between the singular and the plural. And while the Bible will reference a multitude of people in the singular voice, it never never speaks about one individual using a plural voice. So, some examples. And this is where a little knowledge of Hebrew really comes in handy. The majority of Isaiah 53 does refer to the servant in the singular. That's true. But there are a few key parts that blow a huge hole in the Christian argument. The most blatant is in verse 8. The end of the verse ends off, "From the transgressions of my people there was a plague," and then the Hebrew word, lamo. There was a plague, lamo. What does lamo mean? More importantly, how is it translated other times it's used? And the fact is that every time it's used in the Bible, it is translated, even by Christians, as to them. There was a plague to them. However, only here, when you look at Christian Bibles, such as King James, NIV, and others, is it translated as to him, or he, always in the singular, and this particular point. That's odd, no? Why is it different here? The answer is they're trying to push a narrative that the suffering servant isn't Israel, but it's Jesus. And if the facts don't fit that narrative, well, then to hell with the facts. Another example is in the very next verse, verse 9, which reads, "He gave his grave to the wicked, and to the wealthy, bimotav." Now, Christians translate bimotav as in his death. However, to say that, you would have to have a different vowel structure over there. But motav means his deaths, plural. How many times did Jesus die? Or was there more than one of him? But there are multiple Jews who died at the hands of their non-Jewish oppressors. But with the word lamo and bimotav, Christian translators deliberately alter the text to fit their agenda. I would like to point out that some of the Christian study Bibles do make some corrections in translation and identify the servant as Israel. They usually have other problems, but it's a step in the right direction. Okay, let's end with a short inspirational message. We could use it from this week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha. It's such an amazing parsha. There's so much in it. One lesson that we learn is from Abraham's travels. At the age of 75, after following God his whole life, God finally speaks to him. He asks him to leave his land and his father's house, go to the land of Canaan, of Israel. But then, when he gets there, there's a famine, and he has to go to Egypt for food. This was to test him, to see if he would complain that he followed what God wants, and now there's trouble, there's problems. Of course, Abraham passed with flying colors. And all too often, we feel like if we're doing the right things and listening to God, then why is he making it so hard? Doesn't he want us to succeed? Isn't there some kind of reprieve for following him? The answer is that of course he wants us to succeed. And no, there are no special breaks. God doesn't hold a lollipop and cookies in front of our face so we do the right things. If he did, there'd be no free choice. It reminds me of a story of Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, who was a Hasidic rabbi who lived about 200 years ago. He was famous for arguing with God, so to speak, on behalf of the Jewish people. The story goes that one time he told God, "You put all the forbidden desires of this world, all the impurity, hell, so to speak, this you put in front of our faces. And heaven, holiness, that you put in the books for us to learn about. Why don't you put heaven in front of our faces and hell in the books and just see what your people choose?" Look, guys, life is tough. We have difficult choices to make, and they don't always work out the way we want. But Abraham teaches us that you follow God no matter what, even when it seems like it's unfair and it comes with hardship. In the end, we know that it's right and just, and that's why we do it. Well, that's it for this week. As usual, there's definitely more to what I mentioned today, so feel free to continue the conversation with me at Oswego Rabbi on Twitter, or you can email me at rabbi@jewishoswego.org, or go to the Facebook page, Jews Did It First. And again, if there's a particular issue you want explained in a future episode, let me know and I'll try to get to it sooner. Until then, enjoy the rest of your week, and Shabbat Shalom.
were sweet and lips graceful, I would still